Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Minerva Inwald. I'm a Judith Nielsen postdoctoral fellow in contemporary art at UNSW Sydney. Before we get started today, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the unceded territory of the Bedegal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. Our talk today is part of the Sydney China Distinguished Fellowship Program for 2024. And the event is co-hosted by the Discipline of Chinese Studies in the School of Languages and Cultures at the University of Sydney, as well as the China Studies Centre, also at the University of Sydney. The fellowship program is enabled by the generosity of Mr. James Lee, a University of Sydney alumnus now based in Hong Kong. This event is also part of the Talks in Chinese Humanities series, co-hosted with the Australian Society for Asian Humanities and UNSW Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture's Judith Nielsen Chair of Contemporary Art. I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished speaker today. Christopher Connery is professor in the literature department at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he teaches cultural studies, Chinese studies, and courses in Marxist and neoliberal theory. He has also served recently as a visiting professor in the Graduate Department of Cultural Studies at Shanghai University. His research covers four key areas: early imperial Chinese culture and history, oceanic ideology and mythos in global capitalism, the global 1960s, and contemporary Chinese culture, ideology, and politics. Since 2010, he has been involved as a writer, performer, and political consultant in the Shanghai-based Chinese language, social, and experimental theatre group, Grass Stage, which has performed throughout China, as well as in Hong Kong, Japan, Taiwan, Macau, and North America. So just to let you know how the event will be running today, Professor Connery will deliver his talk, and there will be time then for questions at the end. So both during the talk and after, you can put your questions in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen, and I will read them out. So I'm now delighted to hand over to Professor Connery for his talk today titled Grass Stage and the Fate of Social Theatre in Xi Jinping's China. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Minerva, and thanks everyone for coming. I'd like to thank everyone here at the University of Sydney who's made my visit so pleasant. Megan Morris and Elspeth Probin for inviting me, Josh Stenberg, David Gold. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold. David Goodman, Zhang Yanping, Professor Zhao and Wang Wei in the Chinese department, Lisa here in the center. It's been very welcoming, very warm, and it's been a great place to work and to be. So Grass Stage was founded in 2005 by director Zhao Chuan, who was in Sydney 2 weeks ago. Maybe some of you saw the thing that he and I did together. And it continues with his direction to this day. I've been in the group, as Minerva said, since 2010, working as performer, political consultant, writing participant, etc., less actively since 2019. I didn't get into this through a particular interest in theater. I think it'll become clear that this project is in many ways at an oblique angle to theater studies. And for me personally, my involvement with Grass Stage has blurred the boundaries between intellectual work, theater work, and political work. In today's talk, thinking about Grass Stage as social theater, I want to give particular inflection to the term social and suggest that the group's ethos and practice gave a distinctive valence to that term, and that the group's history allows valuable insights into subjective and social transformations in China over the last 25 years. So theater is, of course, inherently a social medium, bringing into heightened form of contact performers and audiences in an evental space. The term social theater generally connotes political engagement, often with a united front version of the popular. Its opposites, commercial, classical, art theater. So as is well known, theater has been central to the Chinese Revolutionary Project. Cultural officials in the Maoist period and after took theater's political potential very seriously, and that establishes a context for the political character of theater that would get reflected in the reform period. The theater that did arise then, Gaoxing Jian, and Mabel Lee here at Sydney is an early translator of Gaoxing Jian, is a prominent example. That had a clear social character, but it also established affinities with pre-revolutionary committed theater and global currents of experimental theater. Social content didn't disappear in the experimental and avant-garde theater that followed, particularly in the 80s and 90s, although as Rossella Ferrari has suggested with her category of the pop avant-garde, and she refers to the director and playwright Meng Jinghui in a key way, there's an alteration in a piece's social content and political valence when it appears within a commercial and aesthetic mainstream. Grass Stage didn't arise out of mainstream or experimental theatrical scene. The milieu in which it arose was the People's Theater movement that included politically engaged theater workers across East and Southeast Asia. I could speak more about that in questions if you want more details. These scenes in Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, as well as similar groups in Thailand, India, and Indonesia, had very close connections with political movements, workers' movements, peasant movements, etc. Things were different in China, of course. As Zhao Chuan, director, would say to explain to foreign interlocutors, in China, we can't do politics, so we don't do political theater, we do social theater. Zhao Chuan also refused the label of dissident, and in my experience was always irritated when foreign interlocutors brought up the issue of censorship. He found both in the label dissident and in censorship discourse a too easy and quick confirmation of Western preconceptions. It was important to him for the group's work to be interior to Chinese social conditions. To explore the category of the social, I want to start with giving you a sense of the basic of Grass Stage's theatrical practice. Membership has changed over the last 20 years. You'll see in this talk that the 2018 production of Cao Jie, Wild Seeds, coincided with an intergenerational transfer, as well as some significant divisions in dividing points in China as a whole. After 2018, only Wu Meng, Zhao Chuan's partner, and Zhao Chuan himself remained from the earliest days. I came now and then, and one other actor did too. This description I'm going to give, though, pertains to the group's whole history. The group aims to meet once a week. Venues change. It's never had a permanent home. Temporary meeting and rehearsal spaces are donated through various channels, and they've included art exhibition spaces, unused commercial spaces, warehouses or office spaces, university hallways back in the days of low surveillance at universities, and the downstream garage. That's what this says, the downstream garage. This is a from 2004 to 2013, that was Shanghai's most important non-commercial alternative performance space, and it offered rehearsal and performance space free of charge and without administrative constraints. So group members are non-professionals. They've come from society at large, albeit mostly from educated classes. Some may have been in their university's drama clubs, but none came from the official theater academies. There's no audition or selection process. Anyone wanting to join the group is invited to come to a meeting. If they keep showing up to meetings, they become part of the group. In several years, the group has hosted a spring seedlings class, workshops advertised on social media, and constituting a somewhat more organized introduction to the group's aesthetics and ethos. Members do theater exercises such as those used in Brazilian Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed. They work out small routines among themselves, do physical exercises. Those who are interested stay on. Weekly meetings consist of physical exercise, exploration of space, working out of bodily routines, working with physical objects. For example, in one exercise, Zhao Chuan asked all members to pick an object in the room and work out a routine in relation to that object. One performer took a book, balanced it on his face as he duck walked blindly around the stage, and that became the basis for a very key scene in The Little Society. The body functions in a distinctive manner in Grass Stage productions. Zhao Chuan and early members of the group gained a sense of body aesthetics and politics, primarily through work with Wang Molin, Taiwan, and Ohashi Hiroshi, Japan. For Wang Molin, in a Foucauldian vein, the body is the site of and bears the imprint of disciplinary apparatuses, and it's also through the body that new forms of subjectivity and sociality can be explored. Much of Ohashi's work sought a deconstruction of bodily habitus through a tension-filled focus on repetitive bodily motion. One of Ohashi's productions consisted primarily of performers walking back and forth across the stage. It was a lot more interesting than it sounds. The body work in Grass Stage was not aimed at cultivating or refining technique, but at cultivating attention to and awareness of the body as the site of experimentation and exploration of new means of relating to the physical and social environment. I want to distinguish this experimental and exploratory dimension from expressivity, and this applies particularly to the pre-2018 period. Performers were not encouraged to, in their movements, give physical expression to an emotional state. Rather, performances used the body and movement as a site of exploration and relationality. They worked very hard on the microkinetics of their physical presence on stage, not with the intention of mastering the vocabulary of performance repertoire or stringent adherence to the director's vision, but rather in pursuing their own physical attentiveness. And this includes an attentiveness, I want to stress, to physical and social context, to its limits. Some of the weekly meetings are discussion meetings, and through discussion, a theme or object of concern arises. Members might suggest readings, viewings, or social investigation activities. The fruits of these efforts are brought to meetings and form the basis for the individual or small group performances. Gradually, these, as well as exercises from workshops, coalesce into a production. Founding director Zhao Chuan at some point produces a script. Further work on the script produces changes and variations. Scripts include text by participants, quotations from writings of others, material written by Zhao Chuan. The compositional practice thus has a curatorial, collage-like dimension, an assemblage of various fragments. The solo routines that performers work out during rehearsal and workshops are combined into a whole that could sometimes be in some tension with the performer's original intent. On several occasions, I witnessed performers objected to Zhao Chuan's lines written for them, and they wrote their own replacement lines. Particularly in the pre-2018 period, there could be a depersonalization in the way Zhao Chuan arranged individual performers' parts in relation to the whole. At one point, a member joined the group who worked in the police department, in addition to being a practicing psychologist. He was an authoritarian personality, and that rubbed a number of the performers the wrong way. In Unsettling Stones, 2012-2013, and in World Factory, 2014-2016, his authoritarianism was made part of his performance, and to great effect, in part because of its unstudied dimensions. These kinds of tensions complicate the standard function of direction, as well as the performer-director relationship. In this earlier period, the pre-2018 period, the tension between performers' explorations and the arrangement of the whole were inherent to the performances. Performers of the same generation as Zhao Chuan saw in direction not guidance from above, but a simple necessary function. Post-2018, Zhao Chuan acted largely as a normal director and was treated as an authority, not as an equal, by the performers, all of a younger generation. Provisionally finished scripts are performed in Shanghai, on tours around the country, occasionally abroad. They are continually revised sometimes due to circumstances such as the unavailability of a given performer, often for other reasons. Performances are sometimes in theatrical spaces, but often not, and have also happened in construction sites, a large banquet room in a Hunan hotel, a seaside resort, bars, and community centers. The group does its own staging and lighting, all with the junk aesthetic of poor theater. That's from Grotowski and Boal. It travels with the cheap portable lights used at construction sites. Screens for projections are rags stitched together. Props are minimal and are assembled from materials found in and around the venue, though staging is often done with great precision. Near the beginning of some versions of The Little Society, performed 2009 to 2012, a rag picker standing in a garbage bag hops through the audience onto the stage, then collects empty bottles and cans strewn about the stage. Considerable thought went into the placement of the bottles. It took several hours. Other significant props included bricks, books, old clothes, cheap toys. In World Factory, performers working as assembly line workers in the background to the main action produced props while on stage. Performances don't have a narrative structure, but are usually short vignettes linked by theme, mood, and arranged according to studied compositional rhythms, with or without speech, either with several actors or a solo actor. Several productions have included singing. Performances generally last from 1 to 1.5 hours without intermission. After the performance's conclusion, the director and performers sit on stage for the after theater, a period of conversation between performance and audience members and among audience members themselves. The after theater, up until the last few years, usually lasted as long or longer than the productions themselves, and were frequently very lively, including arguments, laughter, fights, debates, and tears. And at the end of after theater, group members passed the hat for donations. Grass Stage was adamant in its avoidance of the mainstream theatrical scene. The group never registered as a theater group, and this limited the venues at which it could perform, as well as where advertisements for or reviews of its productions could be published. And the group was very clear about its desired location at a distance from the theatrical establishment, from the state, and from commerce. About 10 years ago, Zhao Chuan got an invitation for the group to participate in an activity at the Drama Center in Shanghai. Some of us were kind of interested in this. He said, the center was our enemy. We would not respond. So another sense of the social in this broad, in the broad context here, is in the Lefebvrean sense of social space, a space of sociality not colonized by commerce or administration, and as mentioned above, a space that is always created, transformed, and recreated. The performance's subject matter, everyday fear, marginalized members of society, dichotomy between political theory and social life, labor, problems of youth, pandemic, all foreground social concerns. And this was what initially attracted me to the group. I remember early in my involvement, Zhao Chuan saying to me that he'd received appreciative feedback from people on the right and on the left, and he liked that. I wasn't sure I did. It seemed very un-Brechtian. Why would you want to be liked by the right? I'd been involved with left intellectual work in China, and I had hoped that my cultural work would contribute to those efforts. But after a short while, I realized he was right. I came to understand that the lack of a well-defined political orientation enhanced the dialogic quality of the events and strengthened the exploratory experimental ethos, which was so crucial to its practice and which it wanted to foreground. So I'm trying to give a sense here of the multiple factors that characterize the social dimension of the work. Structurally, the non-narrative montage brings audiences into the scene as makers of sense and meaning. Audience members are primed for an active role. For many years before a performance began, a performer would address the audience saying, "You're welcome to keep your mobile phones on. taking pictures, no flash please, and keep in touch with people outside. Grass Stage values a close connection to society. That was in an early era of mobile telephony, of course, before phones became constant and ubiquitous appendages, and this no longer got said for that. Many scholars who've written about Grass Stage note the use of non-professional performers, commonly noting that the non-professional technique makes the performances more real. I want to suggest some other dimensions of this. And I'll start with the audience, because in addition to non-professional performers, Grass Stage productions, and for the last 5 years anyway, also involve professional audiences. In part because the performances were free, in part due to the variety of venues, theater aficionados, or even people with minimal experience of live drama, were only rarely a majority of the audiences. Even in Shanghai, where the group was based and had a substantial number of fans, certain venues could bring out especially diverse audiences, many of whom were seeing the group for the first time. One production I remember very well was at a community center in the south of the city. The cultural director of the center, and he lost his job not long after we came, had a connection to the group and arranged for a performance. The audience was largely from the neighborhood. The after theater was heated and emotional. Grass Stage audiences frequently came without expectations, technical or otherwise. Comments from the after theater several times began with, "This is the first time I've seen a play." And that really contributed to the exploratory character of the events. Acting technique in theater, particularly in drama, live drama, particularly of the academic kind that has predominated in the mainstream and art theater scene in China, can function as the source of authority for the professional actor. The casting aside of that authority is hard to do and rare. When this authority does not exist at all, when even the authority of the theatrical institution is attenuated due to the choice of venue and the audience's lack of expectations and evaluative standards, both performances and audience make the attention to and construction of the relation central to the theatrical experience. In a 2006 essay, Theater of Interrogation, Biwen Juchang, published in Reading, Zhao Chuan wrote, "Foremost, it is not motivated by formalist artistic innovation, but rather by a desire to achieve a better and deeper understanding of the relationship between theater and human beings. Social life is the main concern of this kind of theater, and the way of concern is not to reflect or represent, but to penetrate and intervene in a more substantial way through active questioning, or to put it more forcefully, interrogation. Therefore, to paraphrase a friend, it is necessary to wring out the truth over and over again like a towel. Reality is never achieved through naturalistic simulation, approximation, or imitation. This kind of theater has to approach the truth of oneself, of one's personal and social community in a certain way, and this process of questioning is theater. It's a way of reflecting on life and all its problems. If one is to ask who are the people, reflection must first be directed at oneself before it is directed at others. Otherwise, it can hardly be effective. Such theater is severe and rigorous. It is not about making a theatrical piece, but rather constitutes the pressure for the piece to take place." In later writings, Zhao Chuan would also stress the draft Caogao quality of his compositions. These incompletions, incomplete technique, incomplete composition, incomplete staging, create a space where all participants, performers, and audience are pressured to create the night's work. In other words, to co-constitute the scene of the social, to, taking Jean-Paul Sartre's terminology, aim toward a group infusion through the deinstitutionalization of the typical theatrical scene and its authority. The extremely lively after theater was a sign that this had taken place. And I personally always preferred the after theater to the productions themselves, for this is what brought newness, challenges, and negotiation. Theater of interrogation is a transformative scene, a scene similar to egalitarian pedagogy, as theorized by Frere, Giroux, Rancière, and others. And this pedagogical sense of the work, underscored by the fact that all works were works in progress, learning from themselves through each performance, has been part of Grass Stage since the beginning. Zhao Chuan once told me that in the beginning, members taught themselves about theater by going to non-mainstream dance, theater, and performance art performances, by reading in Augusto Boal, Grotowski, and others, as well as learning through working with Wang Mo in Taiwan, Chang So-ik, South Korea, who held training sessions for social theater every year in Gwangju. Throughout its history, in particular the earlier period, the group invited dancers, directors, performance artists, and others to give workshops to members. Zhao Chuan told me on several occasions that he had originally thought of Grass Stage as a school without divisions between teacher and student or between faculties. The curriculum would include performance and stagecraft, social issues, and social investigation. The exploratory, experimental, and egalitarian ethos sketched above and visible in production, rehearsal, and performance processes has some parallels with Jacques Rancière's 2004 call for a new kind of theater in his talk, The Emancipated Spectator. The crossing of borders and the confusion of roles shouldn't lead to a kind of hyper-theater, turning spectatorship into activity by turning representation into presence. On the contrary, theater should question its privileging of living presence and bring the stage back to a level of equality with the telling of a story or the reading and writing of a book. It should be the institution of a new stage of equality, where the different kinds of performances would be translated into one another. And all those performances, in fact, it should be a matter of linking what one knows with what one does not know, of being at the same time performers who display their competences and spectators who are looking to find what those competences might produce in a new context among unknown people. Artists, like researchers, build the stage where the manifestation and the effect of their competences become dubious as they frame the story of a new adventure in a new idiom. The effect of the idiom cannot be anticipated. It calls for spectators who are active interpreters, who render their own translation, who appropriate the story for themselves, and who ultimately make their own story out of it. An emancipated community is, in fact, a community of storytellers and translators. Rancière explained that he had been invited to give this talk in connection with his recently published book on egalitarian pedagogy, The Ignorant Schoolmaster. And for Rancière, the philosophical practice of egalitarianism in pedagogy and elsewhere is predicated on experimentation, attention, participation, and suspension of telos. In its use of non-professional performers, in the non-narrative montage character of the performance, in group compositional practice, and the after-theater theater, where the dialogue and translation between performance and spectatorship becomes activated, I think that Grass Stage really approached this kind of egalitarian process. So I want to turn now to a couple of productions, Little Society and World Factory, but in both of which I was heavily involved, to give a more concrete sense of some of these aspects, and then turn to thinking of the recent history of subjectivity through the lens of Grass Stage. Little Society was originally, and remained at its core, a series of vignettes derived from social investigations done by the group members. Sometimes the objects of investigation were the performers themselves. One woman performed and discussed her work in e-commerce. Another performed his problems getting medicine for his terminally ill father. When I joined the cast of Little Society in 2010, my character was a kind of Marxist revenant who began from the audience with multiple language readings from the Communist Manifesto, and who later addressed performers individually with letters reflecting on their predicaments. This was, of course, a version of who I really was. What was portrayed, though, was the distance between the theoretical political program and lived social existence. Authority, when it existed, accrued toward the latter. But the ironizing strategy of theoretical interpretation or contextualization within the performance had a catalyzing effect on the after-theater, which took up the task of social interpretation with gusto, sometimes in the form of an argument about Marxist theory. So a party secretary in Wuhan, for example, explained that the performance's understanding of Marxist theory was incorrect, since the party had decided that the expropriation of surplus value did not constitute exploitation if it contributed to national economic growth. Things like that. I've written about World Factory elsewhere, and here's a link, to a recent essay. This production was based on a long period of reading, investigation, and discussion of issues of China's status as World Factory, and included real and fantastic images of assembly line work, music, either by and performed by Xu Duo, who's right here, and he was a well-known member of the Pizun Workers Art Troupe. In later productions, when Xu Duo wasn't around, we had other singer-songwriters getting involved. Sometimes workers' poetry set to music. The World Factory also included reflections on the history of labor and labor activism, dating from the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester in 1819, a vignette about a left-behind child, referring to children left in the village when their parents joined the industrial workforce by this guy who had been one of those as a child. In the workshop and in the rehearsal process, the group had discussed and strategized about the politics and ethics of representing workers. One performer, in a vignette whose lines were taken from women worker narratives of their working days, recited her lines while jumping rope, steadily increasing the speed of her jump roping until she was too breathless to speak. One performer was a psychologist with a typical middle-class suspicion of political solutions. And I'm speaking about her in real life, not just as her character. She was given the role of a cynical clown psychologist, and near the end of the play, responding to a character who had sketched his vision of a sustainable, democratic, worker-managed system of production, addressed the audience. Ha ha! If you do things his way, will you still have iPhones? Will you still have name brands to wear? Will you still be able to play mahjong, watch your stocks, and wait to die? If you listen to him, your lives will have to change. Scary, isn't it? Is that what you want? Are you scared? Is that what you want? The piece ended with assembly workers storming off the line, hundreds of blue paper dolls filling the air above the stage, with the cast dancing to and singing along with Xu Duo's song, "We Quit." After theater discussions were heated. In performances in Shenzhen with many assembly line workers in the audience, workers argued with audience members who complained about the artificiality of actors acting like workers. A worker then stood up to an academic complaining about this politics of representation to see she'd been very happy to see about a play about workers in Shenzhen, so near her factory. In a Chengdu performance in a bar, where one of the performers had previously been an assembly line worker, one of the audience members, using a line one heard with some frequency from the middle class, said that no one who had worked hard enough in school and studied hard enough needed to work in a factory. Lots of arguments there. In Shanghai, an academic in the audience castigated the director and cast for the play's ending. "Are you really advocating a mass strike? Don't you think it might be a tad irresponsible to goad people onto actions that could get them killed?" World Factory was kind of a turning point for Grass Stage. In the workshop and performance period, the group got to know a group of Shenzhen workers and members of the Qinghu NGO with which they were associated. And there was a long period that ended in 2019 of cooperation with the Qinghu Workers Theater. Some members of the group worried that things had gotten too overtly political. The group would be classified as a leftist theater group. For various reasons, World Factory and its end coincided with some people drifting apart from the group. That, I think, would happen in many groups. There aren't too many theater groups where everybody stays for much longer than 10 years. Wild Seeds, 2018, had pretty much a new cast. It began as a study group around the questions of youth. It was around the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement, the 50th anniversary of May 68. The idea was to reflect on contemporary condition of youth, the reflection on historical antecedents. A lot had changed in the group and in Chinese society. So it's common in China to speak of generational types, 70s people, 80s people, 90s people, referring to the birth decade. The big break comes with 90s people. Before that, everyone had experienced something, or the residues anyway, of the old regime. 90s people were not only children of the market economy, but came of age as native users of social media. And I want to conclude this talk with a brief consideration of the post-2018 character of Grass Stage through the lens of historical subjectivity, arguing that the subjective dispositive, what we could call the dominant subjective regime for the younger generation, had altered the terrain of the social itself, and thus also the social character of what individual subjects brought to the work. And I know this sounds totalizing. We can explore that and get into that if in question period, if you find it's too much so. Anyway, I think that these alterations in the subjective field were more significant than anything that the state did in changing and in determining the post-World Factory trajectory. So individuation, subjective transformation, this is a feature of modernity. It was a feature of Maoist society as well as reform society, although that took different forms. Among intellectuals with higher educations or the equivalent, 80s era individualism was characterized as romantic and exploratory. The discovery of this undiscovered continent of the self, the liberation of the self, and all this kind of things was something people evoke frequently. And they often, lots of intellectuals who were identified as leftists in the 21st century characterized their 80s selves, and I thought inappropriately, as rightists. Throughout the 90s, there were in things like discussions of humanism, there were efforts to make sense of this impulse at a time when the pressures put on subjectivity by neoliberalism, and this is something I talked about a couple of weeks ago, and it includes human capital, competition, the desiring subject, consuming subject. These pressures began to make themselves felt. I gotta plug in some juice, I think, to make sure I don't run out. Sorry. Okay, so very simply, I describe the experimental and exploratory character of the self-work in the pre-2018 Grass Stage as influenced by an earlier subjective regime, which was characterized more by questioning than by certainty. When the tensions referred to between performer and director or between performers were reflective of the tensions inherent in any process of self-exploration. They weren't defects to be corrected, but were integral to the subjective field. In addition, the collective ethos and social technologies for group identity had a residual organic character compared to the later period when I will argue that group identity had acquired a therapeutic dimension. Pre-2018 Grass Stage was not a venue for individual self-expression or the healing of individual trauma. When I interviewed members about their relation to performance, one performer said she stayed in it because of the high of performing. That's something that any stage performer at any age would say. Another said she valued the concentration and seriousness and the effort to get it right. A third said he liked the variety of life with a range of performances, workshopping, rehearsing, performing, experimentation. None would say, as became common in post-2018, that it involved telling the truth about oneself or sharing personal pain. Where did this latter-day pathos come from? By the end of the first decade of this century and into the next, by the end of the first decade of this century and into the next decade, the neoliberal subject had arrived in force. Its varied effects, as well as reactions to it, were most visible in the post-90s or post-zeros generation, who had never known anything else. Many commentators in general on neoliberal subjective regimes in the West have noted a paradox. The desocializing neoliberal paradigm takes the individual as the primary social unit, the acquisitor and bearer of human capital, the bearer and maker of risk, the node in market decisions. It's no wonder that this regime of intensified individuation, but it must be stressed, an individuation of a weak and simplified kind creates tremendous pressures on the psyche. Pressures exacerbated by economic precarity in all its dimensions, and a pressure responsible, or at least as many suggest, for the epidemic of depression and anxiety that characterizes the post-90 generations. In one discussion I had about the new generation of performers, Zhao Chuan mentioned to me that they were all on meds and that what they were seeking in their membership was a form of therapy. As the World Factory period drew to a close with departures and new arrivals, Grass Stage was attracting people who wanted to be in the group to develop or perfect theatrical skills. And there were lots of various workshops, movement, dance, performance, art, etc. that were springing up in the big cities. Grass Stage was one of several cultural activities which they were involved with, and their commitment was not necessarily going to be long-term. This reflected in part the consolidation of the Wenyi Qingnian. This is a mildly pejorative term that means literary and artistic youth, but it also has something of the connotation of hipster in the big cities. The gradual rise of Wenyi Qingnian culture was changing Grass Stage's audience too. The non-professional audience mentioned above had been replaced by those with an active interest in cultural consumption. Grass Stage had never embraced the Brechtian product of goading spectators into action. I've tried to stress that in the first period anyway, the relationship between performance and audience was more egalitarian than that. Active spectatorship in that stage meant exchange, conversation, argument, and translation. The productions in the first stage had commonly leaned towards pathos, outrage, testimonial, frustration, various consequences of oppression. Its excesses were generally eerie or macabre excesses. But recall my argument above that the exploratory and experimental dimension of the scenes changed its individualized character. Affect moved to the fore in the post-2008 period, and it was generally individualized. Self-expression became much more central performance than in the past, and it was generally expression of pathos. The stage seemed to serve in part as the confirmation of the performer's existence. Movement was often expressive movement, whose emotional reference were obvious, whether or not the movements were executed with precision. Wild Seeds was the first major production in what I would call the new period. It had its origin as a reading group on questions of youth, and after its original production, the company cooperated with the Dinghaiqiao Mutual Aid Society for a more elaborated version. Most productions were staged in spaces shared without separation between performers and audiences. Quotations from reading in earlier generations writing on youth were featured, but focus was on individual suffering and victimization. The after theater tended toward questions of composition and technique. And this was a big change. In the earlier days, no one ever talked about theatrical technique in the after theater, or their expressions of sympathy. I know how you feel. The non-professional character performances is received differently as well. And I remember talking to a group of graduate students about a production that I thought had included an exaggeratedly pathetic lament about the performer's relation to her parents. And the grad students found my reaction cold and sort of too distant from what they thought was the immediacy of her performance. And of course, I'm not trying to deny the power of subjective pathos. I'm just trying to suggest that the social character is a different one. An analysis of Wild Seeds published in the prestigious theater journal TDR, author Rei Jiaodong writes, Chun's unchoreographed, unskilled falling was not only a challenge to the theatrical framework of acting, but also a desperate cry for the recognition of the psychological damage inflicted on a man when he tries to live up to his social duty as an adult and as a valuable worker. So lack of professional technique is in service of this expressivity. What we could call the pathetic turn is welcomed commonly by audiences. And the social character of Grass Stage, in the various ways I've said that that's formed, is still able to supply a certain version of a reality effect that commercial productions don't. But it isn't any longer a space for experimentation and exploration, for jumping off into another space, for creating a new self. A second generation performer in an essay about her 6 years with the group writes, "The eye that you heard and the eye that you saw, the silence of either active or passive expression is the same as the presence of absence or the absence of presence. Ultimately, this eye that makes a sound is more of an eye than the eye who I speak of." That's 6 eyes in 2 sentences. Or in a 2024 workshop that I participated in with Max Bauer, who is a Dada director from Berlin, he was rigorous in wanting to exclude and discourage self-expression by the actors, many of whom sat out the performance as a result. And one performer remonstrated with him, "Max, this is China. You can't say anything here. The stage is the only place I can feel I exist, and you're not letting me do that." So I've referred to the therapeutic element in productions earlier, and I would say in important ways the group itself was the key therapeutic element. I asked Wu Meng, these are scenes from Wild Seeds, why performances in the new generation were in the group. And she, without hesitation, she answered, "Group feeling." And in many recent productions, there's been at least one scene, often a climactic one like this, where the performers come together in one mass. Okay, now I'm really finishing up. In urban areas, beginning in pre-COVID times and accelerating the post-COVID period, there's been an intensified focus on small group formation, reading groups, city walking groups, discussion groups. Some have distinctive characteristics bound by common politics or intellectual social focus, and the LGBTQ and feminism are really important. Many are more commercial, organized by social media platforms such as Little Red Book, and many of these are lifestyle oriented. Outlets of the small cafe chain Tiaohai organize film viewing, beer tasting, music, novel writing, group novel writing, and other activities for habitués. Sociologist Xiang Biao has been pursuing this community formation as an objective study and as a meaning generation activity, which he refers to in Chinese as Fujin, in English as nearby. This is Xiang. I've observed in urban China that the public is simultaneously preoccupied by the very near, the self, and the very far, the imagined world, but neglect the space in between, and as a result, fail to recognize how the social world is concretely constituted through interconnected differences. The nearby is a lived space where one encounters people with diverse backgrounds on a regular basis. The nearby brings different positions into view, thus constituting a scope of seeing. Such a scope enables nuanced understandings of reality and facilitates new social relations and actions. This nearby could form a line of resistance against the power of the state, capital, and technology that is turning local communities into units of administrative control and value extraction. Indeed, several groups of the non-commercial kind describe themselves as activists, where their primary form of action is simple existence. It could be that the multivalent and ambiguously political constructions of the nearby represent a significant further mutation of the scene of the social, and that with time, lineaments of new forms of social practice could arise from within. You can doubtless intuit that I find in Grass Stage's individually expressive and therapeutic turn an important transformation of the group's original social character. But as I've tried to underline, putting the social into social theater isn't done under circumstances of the group's own choosing, and the widespread impulse of small group creation at least reveals an inchoate desire for some new form of sociality. In an essay published a few weeks ago on social media, one of the post-90s Grass Stage performers wrote about what she perceived with some regret as the predominance of what she called the effects of structural violence on performers. I'm always made aware of the wounds left by structural violence on individuals in these plays, and I always long to grasp those, quote, matters yet to be formed, unquote, in the flow of these gatherings, some perhaps illusions, some hopes. We are indeed the problem, but hopefully there's also the possibility of living together, or perhaps of liberation. Victimization is easy to stage, as Plato noted. The hopes that the performer sketches above are another matter. That will require a time, a point in history, conducive to exploring another scene of subjective politics and developing the techniques to do so. Thank you.